to the Pearl Americas podcast. In this episode, we examine how transnational organized crime and illicit economies affect governance, trade, development, and human security across the Americas and the Caribbean. We hear from Michael Bejos, officer in charge of the Department Against Transnational Organized Crime of the OAS Secretariat for Multidimensional Security. His remarks explore how criminal networks exploit the same systems that sustain legal prosperity, including ports, logistic chains, financial flows, corporate structures, supply chains, digital platforms, and cross-border commerce. Throughout the episode, he explains why illicit economies cannot be addressed only as a criminal justice problem. They also require stronger regulatory frameworks, financial intelligence, customs cooperation, asset recovery, private sector engagement, and international coordination. The discussion also considers the role of parliaments in modernizing laws, strengthening oversight and accountability, distinguishing between informality and criminality, and advancing regional cooperation to disrupt the economic ecosystems that allow organized crime to operate, adapt, and reinvest. This episode was recorded during the 22nd Pearl Americas Plenary Assembly and 10th Gathering of the Open Parliament Network, titled Parliamentary Leadership for Shared Prosperity, Advancing Trade, Innovation, and Security in a Changing World, held in Ottawa, Canada from May 19th to 22nd, 2026.
As we look at the challenges posed by organized crime and illicit economies and their impact on regional stability, the core message I would like to convey is that illicit economies cannot be understood as only a criminal problem, a criminal justice problem. They also are a governance, trade, development, and human security problem. Organized crime exploits the same systems that sustains legal prosperity: ports, logistics, financial flows, companies, supply chains, digital platforms, and cross-border commerce. The challenge for governments is not only to arrest individuals, but to disrupt the economic ecosystems that allow criminal networks to operate, adapt, and reinvest. So in my country, we say that nobody throws stones at an empty mango tree. And the same is true with transnational organized crime. Transnational organized criminal networks exploit legitimate trade systems because those systems offer three advantages: scale, speed, and the appearance of legality. First, they use the ports, they use airports, free trade zones, highways, warehouses, customs brokers, shipping companies, and logistics chains as operational corridors. Illicit goods, very often they're hidden inside legal commerce. Drugs, firearms, illicit goods, illegal timber, gold, wildlife products, and other illicit commodities can be concealed in regular cargo, mixed with legitimate shipments, or moved through companies that appear to be lawful. I don't know if any of you have seen, I'm sure, photographs of drugs being smuggled in various common everyday food products. Second, criminal organizations use corporate structures to create distance between the criminal leadership and the illicit transaction. Shell companies, front companies, intermediaries, informal brokers, false invoices, under-invoicing, over-invoicing, phantom services, and complex beneficial ownership structures allow these groups to transform criminal activity into what appears to be business activity. Third, they exploit the asymmetries between countries. Criminal groups are highly adaptive. They identify differences in customs controls, financial supervision, corporate transparency, anti-money laundering, enforcement, port security, prosecutorial capacity, data sharing, and international cooperation. Where the state is fragmented, the criminal economy becomes integrated. This is why dismantling these connections is so difficult. Governments are often organized in separate institutional silos. Customs sees one part of the problem, financial intelligence sees another part of the problem, prosecutors another, ports another, and regulators another. Criminal networks, however, operate across all of these layers at the same time. The real challenge that organized crime is not just a violence-based model. It is a hybrid economic model that combines violence, corruption, logistics, financial sophistication, and market infiltration. Therefore, the response must be a hybrid response. Criminal investigation, financial intelligence, regulatory oversight, asset recovery, customs cooperation, private sector engagement, and international coordination are required. It is useful to look at these issues through the concept of criminal convergence. Different illicit markets increasingly share the same logistics routes, financial channels, corrupt facilitators, corporate structures, and territorial protection. The same port, financial intermediary, or corrupt official may support different markets at once. Therefore, disrupting one criminal group is not enough if the enabling ecosystem remains intact. The issue is not only that organized crime enters trade systems, it is that in many cases it learns to operate through trade systems, using its legality as logistics infrastructure. And I think that is kind of the core of the problem.
After outlining how organized crime exploits legitimate trade systems, corporate structures, and regulatory gaps, the conversation turned to a key challenge for lawmakers: how to strengthen regulation without creating unnecessary barriers for legitimate businesses and communities seeking to enter the formal economy.
So what is clear is that illicit economies do not simply produce crime. They distort entire economic and social environments. From the perspective of economic stability, illicit economies create unfair competition. Criminally controlled businesses can operate at lower costs because they do not follow tax, labor, environmental, or regulatory rules. They can absorb losses because their objective is not always profit. This gives them a huge advantage in the regular markets of the economy. Sometimes the objective is to launder money, to control a market, move goods, or to gain political influence. This damages legitimate businesses, discourages investment, reduces tax revenue, and weakens confidence in institutions. From the perspective of governance, illicit economies creates a parallel form of power. Criminal groups do not only sell illegal goods, they buy protection, they influence public contracts, they infiltrate local markets, they corrupt officials, intimidate communities, and capture parts of the economy. In some territories, they become informal regulators of daily life, deciding who can work, who can open a business, who can move goods, and who must pay for protection. This is, I think, really where the issue in terms of impact that organized crime has on illicit economies. While it is important and indeed essential to have a robust financial regulatory framework and international standards, there is a real risk at a policy level of confusing informality with criminality. International standards on anti-money laundering, beneficiary ownership transparency, asset recovery, and financial supervision are essential to combat transnational organized crime. Without them, criminal organizations can move money, hide assets, use companies, and reinvest illicit profits with very little risk. However, implementation of that regulatory framework must be intelligent, it must be risk-based, and it must be socially aware. Many individuals and small businesses operate informally not because they are criminal, but because they face barriers, lack of documentation, high banking costs, limited digital access, lack of a credit history, complex tax obligations, geographic isolation, and in some cases, distrust of institutions. If the response is purely punitive or excessively bureaucratic, we may push these actors further away from the formal economy. Countries need to distinguish among the three realities, at least three realities. Legitimate informality, where people and small businesses operate outside the full formalization because of economic or institutional barriers. Then there's also high-risk informality, where certain sectors may be vulnerable to exploitation, coercion, tax evasion, or money laundering, even if all the participants are not criminal. And then there is criminalized economic activity, where companies, intermediaries, or markets are deliberately structured to conceal illicit proceeds, enabling trafficking or supporting organized crime. The solution is not to weaken the standards, but to apply them with better intelligence. Countries should develop risk-based regulation, better data integration, proportional compliance requirements, simplified formalization pathways, digital identity tools, inclusive banking practices, and targeted supervision for high-risk sectors. Financial inclusion and financial integrity should not be treated as opposites. In fact, they reinforce each other. When people and small businesses enter the formal system, the state gains visibility, traceability, tax capacity, and better tools to detect real criminal abuse. Parliaments and governments can help by designing frameworks that reduce unnecessary barriers for low-risk actors while increasing scrutiny over high-risk sectors, complex corporate structures, suspicious trade transactions, and professional facilitators that enable illicit finance. The goal should be to make the formal economy easier to enter, but harder to abuse.
The discussion then moved from the balance between regulation and formalization to the specific areas where parliaments can take action. This included how lawmakers can better understand the financial and economic flows of organized crime, identify legal gaps, and determine where legislative reform and oversight may be most urgently needed.
The Americas are composed of member states that have varying sizes, varying populations, and varying economic situations. And so it's hard to say exactly what each country should do, because also many countries have already done a lot of work in this field. So what I would say in a general sense, I think specifically that the role of the parliamentarians, obviously they can make a decisive contribution, and there are at least three areas that I can think of right now. The first is modernizing the legal and institutional frameworks. Organized crime today operates through companies, through financial systems. They use digital tools, they hijack logistic chains, ports, public contracts, environmental markets, and transnational networks. Legal frameworks must reflect this complexity. This means strengthening laws on beneficiary ownership transparency, corporate liability, asset recovery, anti-money laundering, trade-based money laundering, customs cooperation, public procurement integrity, financial intelligence, special investigative techniques, data sharing, and international cooperation. And some countries have better regimes on some of these issues than others. And so each country would need to look at their own internal legislation to see where the boost needs to happen. But legislation alone is not enough. Laws must create operational capacity. That means clear mandates for government institutions in charge of pursuing organized crime. They must have training, there must be safeguards for the fundamental rights of citizens, and there must be mechanisms that allow prosecutors, police, customs, FIUs, regulators, tax authorities, and international partners to work together. And not only to work together, but to work together with speed and efficiency. We are still locked in this old system from basically 2002 when they approved the United Nations Convention Against Organized Crime, the Palermo Convention. That was in 2002. I don't know if any of you can remember what type of cell phone you had in 2002. We have, the level of complexity has increased, and we are now in a hugely different situation technologically. And all of these laws, for example, the Palermo Convention lists a series of special investigative techniques. For example, they list wiretapping. Where's the wire? So I think a fresh look that takes into account the technological advancement and where we are now and the tools that are being used by organized crime, cryptocurrency, tumblers, mixers, all of these new systems to launder money and to move cryptocurrency across borders with no oversight or regulation are some things that new innovations that organized crime has adopted, and we need to look at our whole system and adjust it to the modern realities. So also there's I think the second area is oversight and accountability. Parliamentarians can ask whether institutions are actually capable of detecting and disrupting illicit economies. Are asset recovery systems being effectively managed? Do customs authorities have data analytics capacity? Are beneficial ownership registries accurate and accessible? Are financial intelligence reports effectively used? Are prosecutors able to follow the money across borders? I think if I'm recalling correctly, almost every country in this hemisphere at some point has had leadership come out and say we must follow the money. So at the maximum political level, there is huge consensus about the need to follow the money. But adopting a policy of following the money has certain financial and structural and legal implications. And so it's not enough to just say, let's follow the money. What does that mean? That means that financial intelligence units need to be strengthened. If we are to, for example, have the capacity to initiate parallel financial investigations for any crimes that have a link to organized crime, the amount of manpower that current financial intelligence units have simply are not up to that challenge, because there's not enough people. So I think that is another side of this equation. Parliaments also have a regional role. Organized crime is transnational by design, so parliamentary cooperation should support harmonized standards, faster mutual legal assistance, cross-border investigative mechanisms, including topics like exchange of chain of evidence, exchange of information, sharing typologies and regional dialogue platforms so that investigators can collaborate. One of the things that we are working on to promote at our department is the formation of joint investigation teams where two countries collaborate on the investigation of a particular crime that is, because of its transnational nature, elements of the crime and elements of evidence are present in two or sometimes three or four separate countries. And so building the capacity for member states and creating the legal framework to allow member states to be able to engage in joint investigation techniques across borders, working with other countries, are an essential part, an essential element in the toolkit to combat organized crime that is transnational.